Nest's share price has significantly decreased by 75% in recent years. Now, in the year 2021 and such, the company was overvalued. However, I took a position myself in the summer of 2024, and I am also currently at a small loss of 14%. Well, what is small? But after careful analysis, I am convinced that Neste is undervalued based on the long-term growth trend. Moreover, Neste has, in my opinion, a small economic advantage, a small piece, a small competitive edge, and I find that very important, at least for myself. Investing is a personal choice. Neste is a company that is also focused on the transition to sustainable energy. Currently, 50% of its production is in oil, but also 50% in renewable diesel. And very interesting, they have a good product called SAF, or Sustainable Aviation Fuel. I believe the future potential is significant, since the government is requiring airlines to drastically reduce their CO2 emissions. And SAF is a nice substitute for that compared to kerosene. Now my current position has decreased a bit. I had taken around 5% profit. And my current shares in Neste are down by 14%. I thought the share price couldn't drop much further, but there you have it. The latest quarterly figures weren't great either. So the downward trend has continued. And keep following us, because I will be providing frequent updates about Neste. I really consider it a long-term investment, and I can just fully commit to it. This happens quite often. You can also see red figures in the loss at this moment, but everything suggests that this has long-term potential. And I will show you why. First of all, Neste is a company based in Finland. It has oil, refineries, but also renewable diesel. More on that shortly. The economic mode is initiated by Morningstar on Narrow. I agree with that. Why? Because Neste has indeed made years of progress and is a leader in developing renewable diesel based on waste products. They are essentially creating a high-quality profit margin from waste. However, at the moment, Neste's share price is facing significant challenges due to a strong cyclical downward trend. I believe we can greatly benefit from this. Morningstar indicates that the current 5 value S's is estimated at 32 euros according to them. Well, the current price is around 15. So, a margin of safety of 50%. If this fair value estimate is correct, let's assume it is not. There are still short-term analyst ratings. And I think it's important to just think long-term if you want to take a position in Neste. And for me, besides the average price target of 20, what is important for Neste is that they are truly striving. Also looking at the culture of sustainability, and I have also spoken to several people at Neste, there is really a transition happening towards delivering more sustainable fuels. One advantage of renewable diesel is simply that it is easily transferable in current diesel engines. So, you don't need to change an entire infrastructure. Now the key figures, and this will be more important shortly in the more detailed analysis of the long-term trend, is that in terms of revenue, one could argue that Neste is not valued much worse than, for example, in 2020. And we see that in the year 2022, the price level was, let's say, around this level of 43, and in 2023, the price has fallen sharply. And what is that in total? That's a decrease of about 20%. Meanwhile, the revenue has not decreased by much more. But this is about the profit decline at Neste. That is very important. So the revenue is significantly higher than in 2016. More on that shortly. However, the profit is significantly lower. Why is it very important? Because in recent years, Neste has built various factories which will contribute to long-term revenue growth. Only if the profit margins are currently relatively lower does that mean that in the future, with a small increase in those profit margins, it could lead to a significant rise in the stock price. Now, the Prime Minister's office also has 44% shares for those looking for stability, but such stability is not currently being provided, as you can see. Nice. The revenue development, a bit more on that shortly. The EBITDA development, you can see they are generating more EBITDA than, for example, in 2020. While 2020 was an all-time high, the stock price is now significantly lower. However, the recent figures for 2024 are disappointing. So yes, in the short term, there is no reason to be bullish. Currently, 50% of that revenue is still generated from oil, 20% marketing service, and 30% from renewable products. What is important now? Those renewable products, they are going to expand. Recently, they have made a lot of investments, perhaps even too many. This is important because it leads to a transition to the new CEO. The current CEO, who was still in the 2023 report, has left the company. However, in its update in the annual report 2023, it also explains that they recently completed a very large project worth 1.6 billion in Singapore, and it will primarily produce renewable diesel with a significant increase in sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, which has the potential for a very high profit margin. An important aspect of Neste's economic situation is that Neste, along with its collaboration in America and a planned expansion in Rotterdam, is building a $1.3 billion facility. Together, Neste is the only supplier to supply sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, and renewable diesel globally. So for very large companies, it is interesting to collaborate with Neste purely and solely because of the supply chain and also a bit of risk diversification from the supply chain. Now, I actually came across a funny story. I came into contact with Nestes because I saw a job vacancy about a project, and I also do a bit of projects myself on a freelance basis, at least for now. And I found that job vacancy interesting for Rotterdam, a 1.3 billion project, specifically to produce renewable diesel. And you can also see that the total volume will increase to 6.1 million tons of renewable products. At this moment, it was 5.5 million. Only in 2020, when the price was still high, was it lower. A little lower than that 5.5. So, a lot has actually been invested to launch that renewable diesel, even more in particular for the SAF production. And that SAF is actually a really good product. However, at the moment, due to the entire cyclical downturn in sustainability, this company is currently facing some problems because of those margins. The margins are simply lower at the moment, and of course people react to that in the short term. Now there is a new CEO, and his findings will be available in Q3 2024. You can find his key messages here on the screen. Neste is still strongly positioned for the long term in the green transition. The current situation is simply bad, so they are going to focus more on increasing revenue, cost competitiveness, and also capital discipline. I find that very important, that capital discipline, because recently they have invested a lot in that renewable transition and perhaps a little bit over the top. However, what is really important is that you achieve a high profit margin from a company specific perspective, and especially on new investments where you achieve a high return or ROI, return on investment. One of the examples is that they are, for instance, foregoing a huge electrolyzer in their Porvoo refinery. That is the oil production in Finland. That oil production, that is their initial factory, which is also the largest. It still produces a lot of oil and is in transition. So that is also something that Neste has been doing recently. They are building a production facility in Singapore here in 2023. They have now invested a considerable amount of money and are going to invest even more in a huge facility in Rotterdam, while the Porvoo refinery and the Singapore facilities have both undergone a significant shutdown, maintenance shutdown. And all of this simply leads, in the short term, to what you could say is just a perfect circumstance of lower profits. And I am actually quite happy about that, because you should invest in companies when the market thinks, oh, this company is not going to make it in any way. Or at least they believe that the intrinsic value is currently lower than what it actually is. I don't think the market is efficient enough to give Neste a price of 14 at this moment, based on long-term development, and I will see that later on. He also points out areas of concern. Interestingly, this gentleman has hired a new CFO, and this new CEO is quite experienced already, and you see that often in such a transition, new people also come in. There is also more of a sense of urgency. Some losers are being laid off from their perspective, and that can all lead to positive momentum, but it also creates more uncertainty, and uncertainty is, I think, the right word. Based on factor analysis, there is a strong self-nested So purely from an emotional standpoint based on factor analysis, Neste is not interesting at all as an investment. By the way, here with the ticker NTYREC. And why? Well, based on valuation, it doesn't seem interesting. For example, the current PI ratio is 25, while the sector median is at 11. The forward PI ratio is very high, while the sector median is at 12. However, for example, the EV to sales ratio is significantly lower than the sector median. Additionally, the price to sales ratio is also considerably lower than the sector median. And the dividend yield is very high. Let's say it is 7% per year. So the only thing I need to do at this moment, because I entered a bit too early, but that's always easy to say in hindsight. By the way, I was up 20% on Neste for a while. But what I need to do now is simply wait very patiently for years and collect dividends until the moment comes again that the entire sector picks up and that SAF shows its potential. And then we will have not only dividends but also enormous price potential. Of course, nothing is without risk, especially when investing, you can lose money. The current market value is 12 billion, but that is in dollars. And the total debt has recently increased. That is indeed a point of concern. It is also related to those capital expenditures. The CEO also indicates that we will focus more on capital discipline. This is very important. The only disadvantage remains when it comes to Neste as a long-term investment. It is a capital-intensive company. Ideally, you do not want to invest in capital-intensive companies, but especially in non-capital-intensive companies because they can simply grow faster, make more profit, raise prices, have less depreciation, and face less risk, among other things. The growth does not look spectacular either, but keep in mind, this is all short-term, meaning current, and for next year, the revenue growth over the past 5 years stands at 14%. The Singapore factory has experienced delay in their ramp-up, so the startup, I already mentioned that I do some project management myself in the startup of factories. I know how that goes. And the Singapore factory that was opened in May 2023 will only be truly operational from 2024. In the middle of that, there will also be a huge shutdown for maintenance. So the potential still needs to be realized. And starting from 2026, let's say 2027, the potential from Rotterdam will also emerge. New facilities are on the horizon. So that revenue growth is going to be just fine. And we already saw here the revenue development, which has been significantly higher since 2019. The profitability margin is not very favorable at the moment. The EBITDA margin is currently only 6%, and the net income margin is just 2%. However, note that the 5-year average indicates that the net margin was higher a while ago. So, cyclical stocks and commodity stocks. And actually, Neste is still a commodity stock. They are making a transition to their renewable diesel with a small economic margin. It is still 50% an oil company, so cyclical, so commodity. And how it comes and goes, that is the fact. And actually, you should start investing when the price is very low, so that when a new upward cycle begins, you can benefit from it. And often that happens exponentially. For example, if that net profit margin goes back from 2% to say 8%, then you have a huge increase in stock price. More important is the return on equity and especially the return on total capital. You can find that in the annual reports and the investor presentations. They work with a term that is stated here. Return on assets. And actually their goal is still 15%. That is mentioned further down here. Here is the target for the return on assets. In fact, the financial target is more than 15%. They have been above that for a long time, but at this moment, they are below that. Well, in the short term, you can see that the debts are increasing and the return on their assets is actually decreasing. So this is actually a very bad situation, but I've mentioned that before. You want to invest in distressed businesses, in distressed industries, and in my opinion, Neste is an example of that with long-term growth potential. It is simply their pursuit of renewable diesel and green energy. So what do we see then? More importantly, when looking at, for example, 5-year averages, the return on capital has consistently been above 10% all this time. The return on assets was also above 10%. Additionally, the return on equity was somewhat higher. Hopefully, the new CEO can bring that back in line. What is more important now is that we see, for example, that the price level of Neste is, when we zoom out a bit, similar to the price level of nearly 2016. Looking at the financial development of revenue, we see that the revenue in 2016 was 10 billion, rounded off, and it is now twice as high. Only the gross profit, well, that is still slightly higher than in 2016. The processing income is significantly lower. We see here 1.1 billion in 2016 and here significantly lower. So this has everything to do with the profit margin. All you need to imagine is what if that profit margin recovers somewhat, then you would see a significant increase in profit. As a result, in the short term, the share will become much cheaper, but this is essentially about the longer term development of Neste. And I will show that shortly using the EPS forecasts, what the potential could be. But in conclusion, always pay close attention to the risks. I already mentioned it. Neste is capital intensive and needs to invest a lot. We are looking at the balance sheet here. You can review the cash flow analysis yourself. The cash position remains quite stable. Not very interesting. You also see huge depreciation. That is, of course, always a disadvantage for this type of company. And the risk is, of course, long-term debt as well. That is currently increasing. It is not increasing excessively high. We have also seen that the net debt to capital is still below the target of 40%, and taking on a little debt can be beneficial. In fact, I love investing in companies that make small acquisitions, so they use cheap debt to increase their returns. But Neste is not such a case. It invests in its own earning model, and that is always, of course, a risk. Especially if long-term debts increase, it is simply the risk. As a result, the risk increases, and the risk does not mean short-term volatility, but rather it means a 100% loss of money, which is something you want to avoid. Looking at the historical valuation, for a long time it seemed that the stock was somewhat below its intrinsic value. Then in 2020, there was a huge hype, and the stock became strongly overvalued. Now, if we look at a more short-term perspective, the stock could decline further purely on a very short-term basis, because it is expected that profits will drop significantly. But if we look at a piece of forecasting, it could be that the potential is quite interesting. We are using the normal multiple here, and I am just looking for the lowest, the multiple. Let's take the one from 10 years. So, over the past 10 years, the average multiple of Neste was 14. That aligns somewhat with a PE of 15, so that makes sense. But let's take the sector median. Then it is 11. This would be it. Now suppose that the EPS is going to increase, and analysts, in this case 20 and 19 analysts, expect that the EPS could increase up to 1.8 by the end of 2026, and you take a multiple of 11. Then you could achieve an annual regulation of 25% for Neste, just in the next 2 years. I think what is more interesting is simply the long-term development may. Suppose that EPS might grow around 10%, then you actually have a normal valuation of PI at 15. That EPS growth could even increase more if SAF really takes off. And if renewable diesel is perhaps the only short-term alternative to replace oil, and when, for example, hydrogen is still lagging behind because it is still uncertain how that will develop, then the potential would be much higher. However, let's be cautious in our assumptions. So, we take a 0 here, a lower multiple, because the EPS expectation in terms of long-term growth of 12% is not on the low side. Let's say that the standard multiple comes out to 9. Then you would even, but this is all theoretical and no one can predict the future, you would have long-term patience from this price level. Could you perhaps achieve a 30% return per year? I doubt whether it is really possible alone, based on all the things I just showed in this video. And I just think about the overall development, all the targets, how the company's doing, the investments they have made. I actually find it very striking that the price level is currently around 14, almost the same level as in 2016. I think that Mr. Market is making an assessment error regarding the long-term potential of Neste, and here, you always have to be cautious, because if you're wrong and Mr. Market is right, then you've actually made a bad investment. However, I believe that there is too much focus on the short term and on cyclical movements. And as I already indicated, it is crucial that profitability increases to the possibility of being above 10%, which has clearly been achieved in the past. And if that profit margin starts to rise again to, let's say, the sector median of 10%, which is not very. If it is spectacular, then there is enormous price potential for Neste. That is my Conclusion based on this analysis, and I am trying to summarize it all in a short video. However, I can certainly tell you that I have reviewed all the annual reports and spoken with people in the company. The only thing you can never be sure about is how successful renewable diesel will become, particularly SAF, even though it is still a small percentage now. So, how successful will renewable diesel become, and will those large capital investments in, for example, Singapore and Rotterdam, and the transition of the Porvoo refinery, will all of these lead to profitable investments? That is really the crucial question. In other words, the uncertainty for Neste is very high, and investors do not like uncertainty, but I think, based on my calculations, and you maintain a more cautious assumption of EPS growth, and you go on to convert it into the discounted cash flow for intrinsic value. My conclusion is that Neste is currently undervalued, and in any case it should come above a price level of 20 in the long term. Let's just say that is the case. Then you have achieved minimal returns, but still an attractive annual dividend, which currently stands at around 8 to 7%. Let's say that on average it is around 4% or 3% per year. That, regarding Neste, I am very curious about what you think of this company, what your findings are. Let it be known, don't hesitate to share. This channel is about sharing inspiration for potentially interesting stocks, especially for the long term. We can sit down afterwards, that can always happen. Yes, that can just always happen, but it's about helping each other share information, so let us know. Thank you for watching.